Rachel jolted awake to the sound of faint clinking. For a moment she lay still, the moonlight casting jagged shadows across her bedroom ceiling. The house was supposed to be silent, but the noise was unmistakable. Pots? Glasses? She sighed, throwing back the covers. It was probably Liam. Padding downstairs in her robe, Rachel entered the dimly lit kitchen to find Liam leaning against the counter, a glass of whiskey in his hand. His broad shoulders hunched slightly, his sandy brown hair ruffled as if he'd run his fingers through it one too many times. "You're up late," Rachel said softly, folding her arms as she leaned against the doorframe. Liam glanced up, his hazel eyes locking onto hers. For a moment he didn't respond, just tilted the glass to his lips. "Couldn't sleep," he murmured. His voice was low, gravelly, almost a whisper in the stillness of the night. Rachel stepped closer, noticing the bottle of whiskey on the counter. "And this is your remedy?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. He shrugged, offering a faint smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. "What can I say? It helps." Rachel hesitated, her maternal instincts warring with the strange tension that always seemed to hang between them. Liam wasn't her son, he never had been, but after 2 years of being married to his father, she felt a sense of responsibility. Still, there was something about the way Liam looked at her that felt different. It wasn't the warmth of a stepson, it was something sharper, more calculated. "You shouldn't be drinking alone," she said finally, reaching for the bottle. Liam's hand shot out, catching her wrist. The contact was brief, but enough to make her breath hitch. Maybe I wasn't planning to," he said, his voice laced with something unspoken. Rachel froze, her pulse quickening. She forced a light laugh, pulling her hand away. "Go to bed, Liam. You'll regret this in the morning." Instead of responding, Liam leaned back against the counter, studying her. His gaze lingered, taking her in as if she were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. "Why do you stay with him?" he asked suddenly. Rachel blinked. "What?" "My dad," Liam clarified, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Why do you stay married to him? You don't look happy." "That's not your business," Rachel said quickly, her tone firmer now. Liam's smirk returned, this time with a bitter edge. "You're right, it's not." He set the glass down with a loud clink and turned to leave, his broad frame filling the doorway. But before he stepped out, he glanced back over his shoulder. "You deserve better, Rachel, just so you know." The words hung in the air long after he disappeared upstairs. Rachel stood frozen, her heart pounding, her mind racing. Something about the way he said her name sent a shiver down her spine. She should have been angry, maybe even offended, but instead she felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name, something dangerous. The following morning, Rachel tried to shake off the lingering unease from her midnight encounter with Liam. She busied herself in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for a salad she didn't really feel like eating. The rhythmic thud of the knife against the cutting board usually soothed her, but today it only amplified her restless thoughts. She replayed Liam's words in her head. "You deserve better, Rachel. Just so you know." It wasn't the words themselves that haunted her, but the way he'd said them, his voice thick with an intensity that felt too personal, too familiar. She was so lost in thought that she didn't hear him enter the room. "Morning." Rachel flinched, the knife slipping and nicking her finger. She hissed, dropping the blade as a small bead of blood appeared. Liam was at her side in an instant. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft, concerned. "I'm fine," she said quickly, grabbing a paper towel to press against the cut. "Let me see." Before she could protest, he gently took her hand, prying the towel away. His touch was warm, his fingers surprisingly steady as he examined the tiny wound. "It's nothing," she insisted, pulling her hand back, but he didn't let go right away. His thumb brushed against her knuckles, and for a brief moment, they stood frozen in the quiet kitchen. "You should be more careful," he said, his voice low. Rachel swallowed hard, stepping away to break the tension. "I'll survive." "Thanks." She turned back to the cutting board, pretending to focus on the salad. Liam lingered, leaning against the counter with an ease that belied the tension crackling between them. He was wearing a faded gray t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair still damp from a shower. He looked every bit the young man he was, casual, confident, and entirely too comfortable. "About last night," he said after a long pause. Rachel froze. "Let's not talk about it," she said quickly, her back to him. "I wasn't trying to upset you," Liam continued, ignoring her attempt to shut him down. "I just—" He hesitated, then let out a frustrated sigh. "I don't know how you do it, Rachel. Pretend everything's fine when it's not." She turned to face him, her expression guarded. "You don't know anything about my marriage, Liam." He crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. "I know enough. I know he's never home. I know he takes you for granted." His voice softened, and he took a step closer. "And I know you deserve more than that." "Stop," Rachel said, her voice trembling. "This isn't appropriate." "Why not?" he challenged, his eyes searching hers. "Because I'm your stepson? Because it's easier to ignore the truth than face it?" Rachel felt her cheeks flush. "You're out of line," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Liam didn't back down. "Maybe, but that doesn't make me wrong." The air between them felt heavy, charged with words unsaid and emotions unacknowledged. Rachel's heart pounded as she struggled to find the right response. She wanted to tell him to leave, to go back to being the distant, aloof stepson she'd known before. But part of her, the part she didn't want to admit existed, was drawn to his intensity, to the way he saw her in a way no one else did. "I think you should go," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Liam hesitated, his gaze lingering on her face. For a moment she thought he might argue, but then he nodded. "If that's what you want." "It is," she said, though the words felt hollow. He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hall. Rachel stood in the empty kitchen, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the counter. She told herself she'd done the right thing, that setting boundaries was the only way to maintain control. But as she stared at the half-prepared salad in front of her, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd let something important slip through her fingers. Rachel avoided Liam for the rest of the day. She told herself it was for the best, that keeping her distance would smooth over the tension from the night before and their unsettling conversation that morning. But as evening fell, she found herself pacing the living room, glancing toward the staircase that led to his room. Her husband, Greg, was gone on another business trip, leaving the house eerily silent. It had been weeks since they'd had a real conversation, months since they'd shared anything resembling intimacy. And now, Rachel was left with her thoughts, and the lingering memory of Liam's piercing words. "You deserve better, Rachel." The weight of those words hung over her as she poured herself a glass of wine and settled on the couch, attempting to distract herself with a book. The words blurred together, though, her mind spinning in circles around the same questions. What did Liam see when he looked at her? Did he really care about her? Or was this some misguided attempt to provoke his father? The sound of footsteps startled her, and she looked up to see Liam standing at the edge of the room. He'd changed into a black hoodie and jeans, his hands tucked into his pockets. "Hey," he said, his voice softer than usual. Rachel's fingers tightened around her glass. "Hi." He hesitated, then nodded toward the wine bottle on the table. "Mind if I join you?" She wanted to say no, to tell him she needed space, but the words caught in her throat, and instead she found herself nodding. Liam crossed the room and sat on the opposite end of the couch, keeping a respectful distance. He poured himself a glass and took a sip, his movements slow and deliberate. For a while they sat in silence, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. "I wasn't trying to upset you earlier," Liam said finally, breaking the silence. Rachel stared at her glass, swirling the wine absently. "You have a way of doing it without trying." He smiled faintly. "Guess I'm good at that." She sighed, setting her glass down on the table. "Liam, whatever's going on here, whatever you're trying to do, it needs to stop." His expression darkened, and he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. You think I'm trying to mess with you? I'm not. I'm just... He trailed off, running a hand through his hair. I'm worried about you, Rachel. Why? She asked, her voice sharp. Why do you care so much? He looked up at her, his hazel eyes filled with something raw and unguarded. Because I see you, he said simply. You think my dad does? You think he even notices what you're going through? Rachel's chest tightened, his words cutting through the defenses she'd spent years building. She opened her mouth to respond, but Liam wasn't finished. He doesn't deserve you, he said, his voice firm. And you know it. That's enough, Rachel snapped, standing abruptly. She turned away, pressing her hands to her temples. You don't know what you're talking about, Liam. You're young, and you don't understand how complicated these things are. Liam stood, his movements slow and deliberate. Maybe I don't, he admitted, but I know what it's like to want someone who doesn't see how much they mean to you. Rachel froze, her heart hammering in her chest. She turned slowly, her breath catching at the intensity in his gaze. This isn't fair, she whispered, shaking her head. I'm not trying to be fair, Liam said, stepping closer. I'm trying to be honest. He stopped just a foot away from her, his presence overwhelming. Rachel's pulse raced as she stared up at him, torn between the instinct to run and the magnetic pull keeping her rooted in place. This can't happen, she said, her voice trembling. Why not? He asked softly. Because it's wrong? Or because you're scared of what it means? Rachel swallowed hard, unable to find an answer. The room felt stifling, the air heavy with unspoken tension. Liam reached out, his hand brushing her cheek lightly. The touch sent a shiver down her spine and she closed her eyes, her resolve crumbling with every passing second. Tell me to stop, he murmured, his voice barely audible. Rachel opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. Her lips parted, but no words came. She couldn't tell him to stop, even though she knew she should. And then, in a moment of weakness she couldn't take back, she let him close the distance between them. Rachel jerked away at the last second, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She held up her hands, creating a barrier between them, even as her body betrayed her with its trembling. This is wrong, she said, her voice cracking. Liam, you're my stepson. This can't happen. Liam didn't move, but the intensity in his gaze didn't waver. I know what you're thinking, that this is some stupid game to me. It's not, Rachel. Her heart twisted. The sincerity in his voice, the vulnerability etched across his face, it was almost too much to bear. I need you to stop, she whispered, stepping back. Please, just go to your room. For a moment it looked like he might argue, but then he nodded, stepping away. His jaw clenched, and his hands balled into fists at his sides. Fine, if that's what you want. It is, she said, though the words felt hollow in her throat. Liam turned and left the room, his footsteps heavy on the stairs. Rachel stood frozen, her hands trembling as she gripped the back of the couch. She felt as though the room was closing in around her, the weight of what had almost happened pressing down on her chest. What is wrong with me, she thought, her mind racing. The next few days passed in an uneasy silence. Rachel went out of her way to avoid Liam, keeping herself busy with errands and phone calls. But no matter what she did, she couldn't escape the memory of his words, his touch, or the raw emotion in his eyes. Late one evening, as she sat in the living room scrolling through her phone, she heard a faint knock on the door. Rachel, Liam's voice was muffled but unmistakable. Her pulse quickened. She debated ignoring him, but something in his tone, soft, hesitant, made her get up. She opened the door to find him standing there, his hands stuffed in the pockets of his hoodie. What do you want? She asked, keeping her voice as neutral as possible. I need to talk to you, he said. Please. Rachel hesitated, then stepped aside, letting him in. He walked to the couch and sat down, his posture tense, like he was bracing himself for rejection. I'm sorry, he said finally, breaking the silence. She crossed her arms, staying near the door. For what? For making you uncomfortable. For putting you in that position, he said, his eyes fixed on the floor. I wasn't trying to mess things up. Rachel softened slightly, his remorse catching her off guard. She walked over and sat in the chair across from him, keeping some distance between them. I don't know what's going on with you, Liam, she said, but this can't happen. Whatever you're feeling, you need to let it go. Liam looked up, his eyes glistening with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Do you think it's that easy? Just letting it go? It has to be, she said firmly, though her voice wavered. He let out a bitter laugh. You don't get it, do you? I've tried to ignore it, to pretend like I don't feel this way. But I can't, Rachel. I've never been able to. Her chest tightened, her resolve faltering. You don't mean that. Yes, I do, he said, his voice rising. I've watched you, Rachel. Watched the way he treats you, the way he takes you for granted. And I've spent the last 2 years wondering how someone like you could ever end up with someone like him. Stop, she said, her voice trembling. No, you need to hear this, he said, leaning forward. You deserve to be loved, Rachel. Really loved. And if he can't do that, Liam, stop, she cried, cutting him off. He froze, his expression pained. I can't do this, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I can't be the reason you destroy your relationship with your father, or mine. Liam leaned back, running a hand through his hair. It's already destroyed, he muttered. Rachel frowned. What are you talking about? Liam hesitated, then looked her in the eye. You think he's faithful to you? Her blood ran cold. What are you saying? I've seen him, Liam said bitterly. I've seen him with other women, Rachel. It's not just business trips he's going on. She shook her head, refusing to believe it. You're lying. I wish I was, Liam said, but I'm not. I didn't want to tell you, but you need to know. He doesn't deserve you. Rachel felt the room spin, her world tilting on its axis. Could it be true? Had she been blind to the truth all this time? Liam reached out, his hand hovering near hers. I'm sorry, he said softly. You deserve so much more than this. She looked at him, her heart breaking and her mind reeling. For the first time, she didn't pull away. Rachel sat frozen, Liam's words reverberating in her mind. Her husband, unfaithful. It seemed impossible, yet the look in Liam's eyes spoke of certainty. You're wrong, she said weakly, her voice trembling. You have to be wrong. Liam shook his head. I'm not, Rachel. I've seen him, twice. The first time was a year ago, and I didn't know what to do. I thought maybe it was a one-off, that he'd come to his senses. But it happened again. A hotel lobby. Same woman. Her stomach churned as the pieces began to fall into place. Greg's distant behavior, the long silences on their calls, the impersonal way he seemed to move through their marriage like it was a chore. She hated how much sense it made. You should have told me, she whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. I didn't want to hurt you, Liam said, his voice soft. But I couldn't keep quiet anymore. You deserve to know the truth. Rachel stood abruptly, pacing the room as her emotions boiled over. What am I supposed to do with this, Liam? Confront him? Pretend it doesn't exist? What do you expect me to do? I don't expect anything, Liam said, his tone measured but pained. I couldn't stand by and let you keep living a lie. She turned to face him, her breathing uneven. And what? You thought telling me would fix things? That it would make this, she gestured between them, easier? Liam rose slowly, his eyes locked on hers. I don't care if it's easy, Rachel. I care about you, about how you're being treated, and I couldn't keep quiet knowing he doesn't appreciate you. The room felt heavy with unspoken tension. Rachel stared at Liam, her emotions a tangled mess of anger, betrayal, and something far more dangerous, something that drew her to him even as her mind screamed for her to step back. I can't do this, she said finally, her voice cracking. I can't deal with all of this right now. Liam's jaw tightened, but he nodded. I get it. I'll give you space. He moved toward the door, but as he reached it, he paused. Just one thing, he said, glancing over his shoulder. What? Don't let him make you think this is your fault, he said softly, because it's not. You didn't do anything wrong, Rachel. And with that, he was gone, leaving Rachel alone with her thoughts and the unbearable weight of the truth. The next morning, Rachel sat at the dining table, staring blankly at her coffee cup. She hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, Greg's face appeared, followed by flashes of Liam's accusations. When her phone buzzed, she flinched. It was Greg. Flying to LA this afternoon. Call you tonight. The message was so casual, so devoid of any indication that he had something to hide, that Rachel nearly laughed out loud. She wanted to call him, to confront him right then and there, but something held her back. Instead, she found herself scrolling through his social media, her fingers trembling. She knew she wouldn't find anything obvious. Greg was too smart for that, but her mind buzzed with doubt, replaying every suspicious moment she'd ignored over the past year. She barely noticed Liam enter the room until he placed a plate of toast in front of her. You should eat, he said quietly. Rachel looked up at him, her heart aching at the concern in his eyes. I don't know how to feel right now, she admitted. You don't have to figure it out all at once, he said, sitting down across from her. Take your time. She nodded, picking at the toast without much enthusiasm. You must hate him, she said after a long silence. Liam shrugged. I stopped looking up to him a long time ago, but that doesn't mean I want to see you get hurt. Rachel's chest tightened. She set the toast down, unable to eat. I need proof, she said finally. Liam raised an eyebrow. Proof? If I'm going to confront him, I need to know for sure. I need something he can't deny. Liam hesitated, then nodded. I'll help you, he said. You don't have to. I want to, he interrupted firmly. You shouldn't have to do this alone. Over the next few days, Liam and Rachel worked quietly to gather evidence. Liam combed through credit card statements, email logs, and travel itineraries using the tech-savvy resourcefulness he'd picked up during college. Rachel hated every second of it, but she knew it was necessary. Late one night, as they sat side by side at the dining table, Liam handed her his laptop. Look at this, he said, his voice grim. Rachel leaned in, her stomach twisting as she scanned the screen. It was a confirmation email for a hotel booking, one that didn't match Greg's business itinerary. The dates aligned with his last trip, and the reservation was for 2 guests. Her hands shook as she pushed the laptop away. That's enough, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Rachel. No, she said firmly, standing up. I can't look at this anymore. Liam rose, his expression concerned. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to push you. She shook her head, wrapping her arms around herself. It's not your fault. I need some air. Without waiting for a response, she stepped outside onto the back patio. The cool night air hit her skin, but it did little to calm the storm raging inside her. A moment later, she heard the door slide open, and Liam joined her. He didn't say anything, just stood beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. Rachel closed her eyes, taking a shaky breath. What am I supposed to do now? You do what's right for you, Liam said. Whatever that is, I'll support you. She turned to look at him, her heart aching with gratitude and something deeper, something she didn't dare name. For the first time in days, she felt like she wasn't completely alone.